Let me see, so I can believe. This phrase, which has operated in the background of humanity's consciousness for centuries, is one of the most powerful conditionings that unconsciously shapes our reality. Because this reflex, developed by the mind to reject any new possibility without proof, draws you back into the same cycle every time. You search for an external sign, a result, a symptom, but unless that sign arrives, you can't take a step, and because you don't take a step, reality remains fixed. Thus, an invisible circle is formed. As you wait for proof, the quantum field responds to the waiting frequency, and new possibilities are delayed from manifesting. However, quantum reality operates with feeling and consciousness before it can be seen. In other words, the true mechanism is not believing without seeing, but beginning to see because you believe. However, this mechanism so contradicts the mind's need for logic and security that many people, even at the most critical thresholds of their lives, struggle to surrender to a possibility they still can't see with their own eyes. The internal software that perceives the invisible as a threat interprets progress without proof as a danger signal and draws you back to the old timeline where past experiences are recorded. Therefore, the same thought patterns, the same emotions, the same choices, and the same outcomes repeat themselves because the observer's position never changes. Every morning, you wake up with the same frequency, observe the same reality, and because you've observed the same reality, you send the same signal back to the quantum, and thus the cycle is complete. While the mind thinks it's seeking evidence to see, it actually reinforces the frequency of the lack of evidence. Because waiting for evidence means, on the conscious level, I don't have it yet. And the quantum field takes this code very seriously. Whatever your frequency tells you, reality mirrors it. If your consciousness says, it doesn't exist yet, it hasn't happened yet, it hasn't appeared yet, then that reality won't be visible, no matter how much you desire it, because the observer is still stuck at the same frequency. The observer effect on the quantum level is precisely this. Depending on your perspective, the potentials that are possible collapse or dissolve depending on your perspective. This is why most people turn back when they're on the verge of a change, thinking their consciousness isn't happening because their eyes haven't yet seen it. However, the invisible is invisible not because it hasn't happened, but because it's about to happen. Just as a seed is invisible beneath the ground, potentials first sprout in silence, but when the observer becomes impatient, they constantly want to remove the soil and check the root. That's when the most critical point of creation is disrupted. The need to control radiates a frequency of distrust, and the quantum field always responds to the most dominant frequency. Unconsciously, you send the signal, I can't believe it until I see it, and reality is fixed according to that signal. This is why many transformation stories slow down precisely at the point where proof is expected, because the observer references past experience, not future possibility. When your logic says, nothing like this has ever happened before, consciousness struggles to accept a new possibility, and the quantum field reverts to old codes. Thus, reality recurs. However, the breaking of this cycle begins when you consciously confirm something your eyes cannot see. When you stop looking for evidence, your observer position changes. When your observer position changes, the probabilities the quantum field projects to you change, because you are now generating a new frequency signature to replace the old record. This frequency is called certainty without proof. This state of certainty is not dependent on any external sign. It is born within, rooted within, and strengthened within. And every time you tap into this inner certainty, the universe begins to align your eyes accordingly. For the consciousness ready to see, the invisible becomes visible because you have now opened the frequency before you can see. This is where the observer's paradox is resolved. The first step is invisible, yet real. There is no evidence, yet there is progress. The mind remains silent, yet consciousness speaks, and reality silently changes according to the observer's new position. This change begins within. The external reflection is always the latest stage. That's why seeking evidence delays you, but certainty without evidence accelerates you. This is how the observer's paradox is resolved. When you stop waiting to see, the door to seeing opens. Think of the quantum field as a boundless sea of potentials, an unseen yet palpable void, a cosmos where possibilities yet to take shape silently vibrate. This field is the source of new beginnings, unexpected transformations, and timelines that have not yet come into being in every human life. However, this limitless potential of the quantum field only accepts a certain state of consciousness, a mind open to possibility rather than fixity, a consciousness that listens to internal determination rather than external evidence, a heart brave enough to consider an unseen possibility real. For the quantum field operates on the fine line between the not yet and the about to. And this line is called the waiting room. This waiting room operates with a very different dynamic from the physical world. Here, time is nonlinear, processes are silent, and signs are invisible. This is why many people, while assuming nothing changes in their lives, fail to realize that the possibilities in the quantum field are silently aligning. This is because the quantum field operates internally first, in the unseen emotional realm, in the frequency signature, in the micro decisions you are not even aware of. Even when nothing seems to be changing on the outside, everything inside may be rapidly rearranging. Like an orchestra tuning its instruments one by one before starting a rehearsal, potentials wait to be certain of their own frequency before approaching you. The silence of this waiting creates impatience in most people. This is because the human mind operates with a rigid code such as movement equals progress and silence equals nothing is happening. However, in the quantum realm, true creation occurs precisely in this phase of silence. Invisible preparation is far more powerful than visible. Therefore, the waiting room is not actually a void. On the contrary, it is the most intense phase of creation. However, during this phase, people often give up, fall into doubt, disrupt their frequencies, and unknowingly interrupt the alignment of possibilities. This is because they misinterpret silence. They mistake silence for not happening. They mistake silence for delay. Yet, silence is the sound of alignment. The quantum realm, like the mind, operates not with noise but with order. If a new timeline is forming for you, this process inevitably goes through a phase of silence. This silence isn't just external, it's internal as well. Emotions calm, old cycles dissolve, and consciousness gathers the vibrations necessary to move on a new path. Therefore, silence is, in fact, the heartbeat of your inner evolution. But there's a critical point here. When you enter the waiting room of the quantum field, if you start searching for an external sign, you lower your own frequency. Searching for a sign carries the message, "It still hasn't happened," which returns to the quantum field as code, slowing the process of aligning possibilities. Moments where people say, "It just happened, but it didn't," are often the result of this frequency drop. Many people feel they're on the verge of a new beginning. They experience an inner expansion, a desire for change, an intensity of energy they can't quite make sense of. It's at this point that impatience sets in, and the mind begins to question, why hasn't it appeared yet? Why hasn't anything changed? I wonder if I'm feeling wrong. Each of these questions dries up the soil in which the new reality takes root. Because the quantum field responds to the clarity of feeling, not the clarity of intention. If the feeling changes, the frequency also changes. When the frequency changes, the alignment process is reset. Thus, a person obstructs creation with their own lack of belief at the moment when potential is strongest. Yet, all that needs to be done is to see this silent phase as a natural part of creation and to remain within it. The role of the waiting room is not to test you, but to prepare you. A new reality cannot emerge from the vibration of your old identity. Silence is the intermediate zone that transforms you into that new identity. As your old emotional patterns fade and your new frequency signature forms, it's normal for nothing to appear outside. Because in the quantum field, Everything is invisible outside until it's completed within. This is why the waiting room is sacred. It's a magnetic void that draws possibilities toward you without you even realizing it. When this void prepares you, external reality appears to have changed instantly. Yet, that change was initiated months ago. The silence phase is the invisible architecture of that change. Therefore, remaining steadfast in the waiting room of the quantum field is the most powerful step toward conscious creation. Impatience disrupts alignment. Surrender accelerates it. When you can remain in silence, possibilities move closer to your timeline. Because you begin to see the invisible not as a threat, but as potential, the waiting room of the quantum field opens at that moment. When you are ready, there's only one way for a reality to become visible in your life. It must first exist within you. Be written into your frequency signature. Everything you see in the external world is the reflection of a vibration, a decision, an emotional alignment that was formed much earlier in the deep layers of your consciousness. Therefore, on the quantum plane, creation begins not by waiting for something to happen externally, but with something being finalized within. However, most people reverse this mechanism. They first want to see a sign in external reality, and when no sign appears, they constantly change their internal frequency. However, in the quantum realm, the external world is like the slowing shadow of consciousness. The clearer and more determined you are inside, the faster and more consistent the external reflection. But the formation of this inner clarity is a silent process, invisible, yet the foundation of everything. During this process, when your mind impatiently searches for proof, your frequency begins to dissipate, because the new vibration built within is fragile even before it finds its counterpart in the external world. Think of the most sensitive moment for a seed trying to sprout in the soil. That darkness, that state of silence before emerging into the sunlight. Your frequency signature is formed precisely during this phase. As you walk that fine line between the collapse of your old identity and the birth of your new one, it's perfectly normal for nothing to appear to change on the outside, because the invisible is invisible not because it hasn't formed, but because it's nearing completion. While your consciousness synchronizes with a much higher probability, your mind can't yet measure it. Therefore, you experience only stability, calm, and a sense of nothing is happening. Yet, everything is happening at that moment. Your frequency signature is recalibrated precisely during this quiet phase. Old emotions dissolve, new vibrations take hold, and your internal GPS shifts to a different timeline. However, most people misinterpret this phase, reverting to the most critical stage of creation, succumbing to doubt or disrupting the process with their own hands. This is because your mind's believe without seeing reflex is still dominant. This reflex kicks in when your frequency signature hasn't yet stabilized, calling you back to your old vibration. At that moment, when you begin to expect external results before your inner architecture is fully completed, the process becomes unbalanced. Your frequency signature is strongest when there are no signs in external reality. Only the vibration of your inner voice and intention is active at that moment. Silence is a natural part of internal construction. It indicates not that something is absent, but that something is taking root. But when you interpret this silence with impatience, you halt creation. Therefore, the most powerful step in the quantum realm is to acknowledge that something is happening before it is even seen. Creation begins in the invisible. The visible is merely a delayed outcome. The encounters, opportunities, and seemingly coincidental events you see in the external world are actually the external counterpart of the frequency construction you initiated months ago in your conscious field. When you internalize a thought, transform an emotion, or clearly define an intention, the quantum realm references this new frequency and begins to organize its counterparts on the invisible plane. However, the reflection of this organizing process in the physical world is always delayed, because the transformation of consciousness is faster than light, while the transformation of matter is slower than light. The mind, misinterpreting this delay, generates the frequency of, "It still hasn't happened." And it's precisely at this point that creation weakens, because the quantum field hears what you vibrate, not what you say. The frequency of, "It hasn't happened," suppresses the frequency of, "It will happen." The frequency of "it's delayed" interrupts the frequency of "it's aligning." The frequency of "nothing changes" renders invisible what is already changing. Therefore, the silence within the inner architecture requires not only patience but also conscious surrender. Surrender isn't waiting. It's trusting the accuracy of the frequency, because a frequency signature doesn't appear outside until it's completed within. Those who pass this stage radically transform their reality. Those who fail to pass relive the same cycles. This is why the silent construction of the frequency signature is the most sacred part of creation. While nothing is visible from the outside, everything takes shape within. Possibilities see you before you see them. Reality aligns before you know it. Your new timeline is silently born before you realize it. And when one day something outside seems to have changed suddenly, you realize that the change actually started much earlier. Contrary to what most people believe, the beginning of true transformation doesn't come with a result, a sign, or the whispered proof of the outside world. The true beginning is born in that first inner step you take, in the absence of any evidence, in that silent moment when your consciousness begins to accept an unseen possibility as real. Because on the quantum plane, the universe first responds to your determination, then begins the process of reflection into material reality. Therefore, proceeding without evidence isn't recklessly taking risks. It's becoming conscious enough to surrender to an unseen frequency. This is the most difficult test for the mind, because the mind carries an ancient mechanism that derives its security from the validation of the outside world. I can't believe it unless I see it with my own eyes. However, this mechanism supports the repetition of old realities, not the emergence of new realities. Seeking evidence is trying to shape the future with the data of the past. Acting with an old logic when stepping into a new possibility is like trying to unlock a door with the wrong key. When the door doesn't open, you don't think the key is wrong, but that the door is locked. That's why many people say they feel ready for change, but just when they have to take the next step, they wonder, what if it doesn't happen? Yes, I'm afraid. Quantum reality, however, operates precisely on this principle of, there's no evidence, but there's a state of knowing within me. Because this state of knowing is the purest, most powerful form of frequency, the quantum field responds to your inner clarity, not the external appearance of the situation. Progress without evidence, therefore, is not a belief, but a stability in frequency. You first know within yourself that a vision will come true. This state of knowing creates an invisible pull that pushes you forward, even when there's no sign of it in the outside world. The universe cannot remain indifferent to this pull, because every intention sends out a vibration that summons its own appropriate timeline. When you emit a stable frequency, the architecture of possibilities begins to reshape around you. People call this coincidence, luck, or a coincidence. But in reality, it's the result of a quantum alignment you've unconsciously initiated. Perhaps the most paradoxical aspect of progress without evidence is this. As you search for evidence, progress slows down. When you let go of the need for evidence, progress becomes visible, because seeking evidence sends a signal in your conscious mind that it hasn't happened yet. This signal contradicts newly emerging possibilities. On the one hand, you step into the new, but on the conscious level, you nourish the old. The universe, however, does not respond to unstable frequencies, because in the quantum realm, clarity means speed. The clearer you become, the faster the process. The more you doubt, the slower the process. Therefore, the essence of progress without evidence is clarity. I don't see it yet, but it's happening. This simple phrase is one of the strongest bridges between consciousness and matter. As you walk through the invisible, your mind will demand evidence, occasionally urging you to turn back, halt the process, or succumb to doubt, because the mind's job is to protect you from the unknown. But the heart's job is to expand the unknown. When you do your heart's work, the universe will, over time, reveal evidence that will convince your mind. But this process always works in reverse. First, the step, then the evidence. First, the frequency, then reality. First, inner resolve, then outer reflection. This is why universal transformations begin without evidence, because evidence is a sign of what has already occurred, not creation. The need to first externally verify the reality of something weakens the creative power within consciousness. Therefore, major transformations are often preceded by uncertainty. This uncertainty is, in fact, the birth pangs of creation. This interim phase, where your old identity dissolves and your new identity is not yet fully established, is the universe's way of preparing you for a new timeline. If you retreat during this phase, you return to your old frequency. But if you continue to progress in this phase, the magnetic door to a new reality opens. Because the quantum field bows to your determination, and with that small step you take, even without any indication, you send a profound message to the universe. I am ready. This message activates all possibilities. This is where the universal transformation begins invisibly, silently, and inevitably. Therefore, progress without evidence is not merely spiritual courage. It is an adaptation to the universe's most fundamental operating mechanism. When you abandon evidence, the universe begins to generate evidence for you, because now your observer position has shifted, your timeline has been renewed, and your frequency signature has begun to call forth your new reality. Every journey that begins without evidence will one day become evidence itself. The greatest obstacle that stops the realization of a wish, an intention, or a desire for transformation that you have been carrying secretly for years is often not inaction, but on the contrary, over-observation, because constant observation. Did it happen? Why didn't it appear? When will it happen? I wonder if it is going wrong. Or quote, when, will, when, will, end quote, unquote. Unknowingly creates a frequency of resistance in the consciousness, and this resistance is the thinnest yet strongest wall that interrupts the flow of the quantum field. The mind thinks it will create security by control. However, on the quantum plane, control doesn't work. But opening space, opening space means letting go of observation, not trying to forcibly speed up the process, and respecting the invisible side of conscious creation. Because the human mind perceives the unseen as a threat, it interprets the fact that something is not yet visible as not happening. The greatest transformations in the quantum field take place precisely in the invisible phase, because the invisible is invisible not because it is missing, but because the story is still being written, During the writing process of a book, there is no constant pressure to check the pages. Nothing becomes visible until the writer's mind flow is completed. The universe works the same way in the creation process. First, it is completed within. Then it appears outside. But the mind's impatience can disrupt this natural process. The miracle of ceasing observation begins here, because observation, while trying to measure external reality, simultaneously narrows the energy flow of consciousness. Measurement is an action that fixes potential. Even in quantum physics, it is known that observation changes the behavior of a particle. This is exactly what is called the observer effect. Possibilities in a potential state collapse according to the direction of observation. If you constantly focus your attention on the "it didn't happen" signal, the mind's observation narrows the potentials. Only familiar but limited possibilities similar to your past experiences become visible. This is why experiencing the same cycles is inevitable, because the observer continues to observe the old timeline. However, when you stop observing, the potentials expand again. When the pressure of the mind is removed, the natural flow of the quantum field begins to reveal itself. The real miracle in this process is the strengthening of consciousness the moment the mind withdraws from the equation. While the mind is constantly controlling, the heart field does not come into play. Intuitions, inspirations, synchronized events, and guiding signs that seem like coincidences but are actually invisible become invisible. When the mind raises its voice, the voice of the soul cannot be heard. When the mind is silenced, the soul's whisper becomes clear. Letting go of observation means making room for this whisper, because true creativity is the work of consciousness, not the mind. Consciousness carries an invisible but felt guidance. It pulls you in a direction you haven't yet realized. This pulling force is felt only when the mind is removed from the mix. That's why the people who suddenly appear in your life, the events that seem like coincidences, and the doors that open unexpectedly, all occur when you stop mental observation. Because in those moments, your frequency of resistance is weakened and the quantum flow strengthened. In fact, letting go of observation isn't doing nothing. It's allowing the right frequency to operate. This state of allowing isn't a passive wait, as many people think. It's an extremely active, conscious, and creative process. Because letting go means surrendering energy to the universal flow. This surrender is not passive acceptance. It is the awareness that there is an order operating outside of me, and I am in harmony with this order. This very awareness opens the door to invisible miracles. Many people think that when they stop observing, the process will become uncontrollable. However, the opposite happens. When the pressure of observation is lifted, the process accelerates. Because your energy is no longer fixated on the question, is it happening? It shifts to the frequency of, it is happening. Even time flows differently in the absence of observation. Processes accelerate. Unexpected harmonies occur, and the word coincidence loses its meaning, because you are no longer someone who forces the process, but a consciousness that aligns with it. When the mind is removed, the new line of reality reveals itself more easily. At this point, for the first time, one realizes that the external world is shaped not by one's own efforts, but by one's own frequency. Because when the mind's pressure is lifted, true creation begins. Your heart becomes clear. Your intuition strengthens. Inner guidance becomes evident. Therefore, letting go of observation is not creating a miracle. It is realizing that the miracle already exists. Silencing the mind is opening the universe, and this silent miracle only occurs when the observer steps back. For true transformation grows in the silence of consciousness, not in the noise of the mind. When the mind withdraws, the nascent reality finally becomes visible. At some point, you know the change within you is real, without needing any external signs. This state of knowing cannot be weighed with the mind, verified by the eye, or based on external variables. Because its origin comes from consciousness, not the mind. This very moment is the birth of a new timeline. Timelines change not with events in the external world, but with silent thresholds where your internal frequency transforms. When your inner frequency begins to summon a new reality, a sense of calm, certainty, and completion arises. Even though you aren't looking for an external sign, this feeling is the point at which belief becomes evidence. The mind can't make sense of it, because the mind searches for evidence externally. Consciousness creates evidence internally. This is why a person's inner transformation often occurs long before the evidence in the external world. Before you realize it, your new frequency has formed, your new timeline has been silently established. During this phase, the voices of your old self still call you back. Your old habits try to hold on. Your old emotional patterns examine you one last time. Because each new timeline requires the closure of the old timeline. This closure is often invisible on the outside. It manifests itself with an inner dissolution, a release, a feeling of completion. At this very stage, your consciousness gains profound clarity. Asterisk, I am no longer the old. Asterisk. The root of this statement is not in external evidence, but in an inner certainty. New realities begin to form around this inner acceptance of yours, because the quantum field does nothing but make visible on the outside what is complete within. This is where the power of belief becomes apparent. Faith is not blindly clinging to something. It is the ability to sense the inner frequency of a truth before the outside world. This feeling works like an invisible engine that propels you forward, even if there is no sign in external reality. Because consciousness walks ahead of time. External reality follows consciousness. Therefore, the birth of a new timeline begins not when something happens in the external world, but when you accept that it is within. This acceptance is an inner determination independent of the mind's approval, even when faced with the mind's objection. But there is nothing there yet. Consciousness's silent declaration of, "I know," is a sign that true creation has begun, because the state of knowing is one of the highest frequencies, yet your inner truth was formed much earlier. The birth of your new timeline is most evident in these moments. You no longer make the same decisions as your old self. You no longer react to the same events with the same emotions. A silent distance has now formed between you and the past. This distance is a sign of a completed transformation in consciousness. You now know more clearly who you are, what you deserve, and where you are headed. This state of knowing needs no proof, because your consciousness now feels the power to create its own reality. This feeling is the foundation of the new timeline. And this line is nourished by the energy of your belief. When your belief becomes evidence, reality begins to take the shape you desire, because you no longer wait for external validation. Your reality expands not as much as the external world allows, but as much as your consciousness allows. This expansion silently opens the doors of the universe. One day, when you see something change all at once, you will realize it didn't happen all at once. The real change occurred months ago, inside you. What was visible outside was merely a delayed reflection. This is how a new timeline is born. It begins inside, becomes visible outside, and reminds you that you are the creator of your own reality. Because ultimately, the proof is not outside, it is the certainty within you.